In Noise Bays, the Rebbe is trying to answer that maybe in simple pshat we can say there was a shortage of cedar wood of which to make the wagons, because we learned in the Rashi brought down that they planted before when Yaakov, when he knew that um, the Bnei Yisrael will go down, but we see there was a shortage. Maybe there was not enough cedar wood for the Agola, but the Rebbe doesn't accept that because there was no requirement that the agolas need to be made out of cedar wood, and there was also possibility of buying it from the other merchants from the nations of the world. So why would there be a shortage of making agolas? Base. In Pshute Shel Mikra, in the simple meaning of the verse, Voltman L'cheri gekent verantworten bepashtus, it would seem that we can answer it very simply. Und der Shafar stellt sich nicht Rashi of them, and that would also say why Rashi does not uh, place himself and ask the question why only a half a Hagola, because Friyad in Parshas Truma, earlier in the section of Truma, Benegei zu dem was in Nidvis HaMishkan seine Gewen Atzi Shittim, as it relates to the fact that in the gifts of the Mishkan there was also the cedar wood, the Shittim wood, is Rashi Mefarish. Rashi explains, Umayin hoyin lahem bamidbar. Where did they get in the desert this cedar wood? So he says, Pirush Rabbi Tanchuma. Rabbi Tanchuma explains that Yaakov Avinu tzofa beruach hakodesh. Yaakov Avinu visualized with Ruach HaKodesh Hasidim Yisrael Livnes Mishkan Bamidbar, that the Jews are destined to build a Mishkan in the Midbar. So Vehevi Arozim LeMitzrayim, when he went up from the land of Canaan, he went up to Mitzrayim, he brought along the cedar, the Arozim, Venotum, and he planted them. Tziva Lebonov Litlom Imohem Kshiyetzum Mitzrayim. He instructed his sons to take him with him when they left Mitzrayim. So what do we see over here? So we see that while the Yidden had a lot of spoil of but yet there was a shortage of cedar wood, basement their fun. So we see from this, as afal pias from Bizas Mitzrayim or Bizas Ayam, even though from the spoil of Egypt and the spoil of the ocean, what they got from the Egyptian. Haben die Eden im Midbar gehat an Ashirus Muflogo. The Eden in the desert had a tremendous amount of wealth, Kesef, Zov, silver and gold, Avonim Tevis, and precious stones. Aber Atzi Shitim, but the cedar would haben sie im Midbar gehat. The only way they had it in the desert, nor durchbringen Aros von Eretz Yisrael Mitzrayim. That was only through the fact that they brought the cedar from Eretz Yisrael to Egypt. Und noch pflanzen sie dort, and then they had to plant them there. Hab mit sie zu tun 210 Jahre. They needed to deal with them for 210 years while they were in Mitzrayim, in the slavery. Und noch mitnehmen sie mit sich mit, but then they needed to take him with themselves to the desert. Und von dem hat man gedacht, machen die Kroshma, sie weiter klar Mishkan. That's what they needed to make the crushing, the beams for the Mishkan, and also the vessels of the Mishkan that were made out of cedar wood. Und the river, so we're going to explain, is Mispar HaGolos given nor kefir hachrach. Therefore, the number of wagons was just as minimal amount. There was just no wood available there, the cedar wood, only as essential. That's all what they had. But the Rebbe says, who said the agolas needed to be made out of cedar wood, out of the ashitim? It could have made other woods, and other woods was a supply they could get. She's aber nicht glattig, also to answer. It's not smooth to answer such. But the agolas and given nor mitzad nidvus hanisim. The only reason the agolas came, it was their gift. They decided what they want to give. It came only as a gift of the Nisim. Mibli kol hagbola, the Eibishter didn't get involved. There was no limitation. Sheyiu dafke atzi shitim should be specifically the cedar wood. But tomua bechlal zu sagen, so this is surprising. In general, to say Als bei Mitzrayim hat man nicht gekannt, gefunden Eitzim Chazokim, zu machen mehrere Agolis. That in Mitzrayim they couldn't find strong wood in order to make more wagons. The whole idea of Atzishit they needed to bring from Eretz Yisrael. But in Egypt they would have it. How do they make the carriages over there? So there must have been more carriages over there. So the question becomes again, so why did they only make a one a half a gola? Why did they make it such betzimtzum, so minimal? Well, from Maimon Chazal, and also the Rebbe said, wants to point out from the saying of our sages of blessed memory, as gewisse Sachen hat man gekauft von Tagre Umesoilom, that there were certain items which they purchased from the merchants of the nations of the world, so they could buy. So first of all, they could bring up from Mitzrayim. There was no shortage of bringing up wood, regular strong wood. It was only about the cedar that they had the special issue because they had to make it. The Torah said it has to be Atzi Shittim, both the Mishkan and also the Kelim. And but when we talk about the Agolis, that was their decision. So you could have made something else. So why limited such few Agolis when it seems like they should have donated more? Siv Gimel. Uh, so the Rebbe says that actually it seems like even though the gifts came from the Nisim, they decided on it, but they needed and they got approval from the Eberster eventually. And the question is, perhaps we can say that this was not up to the Nisim. That was the instruction that the Eberster wanted, as we find that it needed to be coordinated and accepted and approved by Hashem. So maybe Hashem only approved that. So it was not a question why they didn't do it. It wasn't up to them. Gimel. The Rebbe said in Sifri, Valderech Ze in Medrash. In Sifri and similar in Medrash. Learned man off from Posik. When the Posik says, Kach meitom, he says, take from them. So it says, Bo va'amdu, so Hashem says to Moshe, go ahead and take from them. So the Medrash says that originally Moshe Rabbeinu wouldn't want to accept until the Eibishter told him, Kach meitom. Bo v'amdu lifnei ha-mishkan, they came, the princes, the Nisim, and they stood in front of the Mishkan. Moshe Rabbeinu did not accept them. Ad shenemar loy mipi ha-kodesh. Until from the mouth of the holy, Hashem says, Kach meitom. Take from them. So meaning, ho hiskima daitum ledasel yonim. Take from them this. So that means that what they had in mind, that was agreed upon, what they had in mind to what Hashem wanted, because David says, take from them. Therefore is verstandig. So therefore we understand that this has divine approval, Hashem's approval, as nidvus ha'agolis, that the gifts of the wagons will be mele misporen, and therefore also how many is kividas Hashem. Everything is done by the way that Hashem wants it to be. Val derech di korbonis was the nisim hom gebracht, and similar to the offerings that the nisim brought, that couldn't be on their own, because that was just their own idea, and the Eibishter agreed to it because those weren't ordinary korbanos. First, they bought these wagons, but then they brought the actual korban every day, and that was for the Chanukas HaMizbeach, the way they dedicated, inaugurated the Mizbeach. So many of the details of their korbanos were just instruction for the time. In Razal, as enumerated in our sages of blessed memory, in Euchen Pirush Rashi, also in Rashi, in the Gemara Menachos, and in our Rashi, Perik Zayin Posik Yudalat. So there, the Rebbe gives an example. These weren't ordinary korbanos. Uladugma, as the Ragzav Ktoidus Yochid. There is no such a thing as uh, giving a Ktoidus an individual. Here, each Nasi gave Kaf Achas, a sort of Zov Malay Ktoidus. What kind of a Ktoidus do you give? Can give a gift of a Yochid for Ktoidus. It was done on Mizbech HaChitzin. And where did they burn it? They brought it on Mizbech HaChitzin. That's not what Ktoidus is done. And Ktoidus is done in the Mizbech HaPnimi. We don't find it elsewhere. So, since this was a temporary lesson, how could they do it? They couldn't do it just in the Nisim alone. It must have been got the approval of Hashem. We'll move on. As a hero shah, something which is an instruction for the time is given us pi haskamas Moshe das Hashem. That was according to the agreement of Moshe, which was Hashem's view. They did it the right way. That's what Hashem wanted them to do. So basically, we see that everything that they did wasn't just on their own. They could make a decision what they want to do, but it had to get the agreement and the instruction, and they were doing based on what Hashem wants them to do. And if Hashem wants them to do a half hour gola, that's a half hour gola, then it wouldn't be a problem. But how do we reconcile this idea that it was Api Hashem Das Moshe Skimo Daitum and it was on their own? Because in the pasuk it says that they brought on their own. Choches is given by Yakriva Nisim Me'atzma. Even though it took place the way it happened, that they brought on their own. And then we said, and Moshe Rabbeinu did not accept from them until the Eibishter told him, Kach me'itom, we could have taken them, accepted them. So, is verstandig bepashtus, we understand very simply as when der Eibishter gesagt, Moshe yakrivu, as karbonum la chanukas hamizbeach, when the Eibishter to bring their korban to chanukas hamizbeach, is the akrove given al pi tzivu Hashem. So then they brought it by tzivu Hashem. So when the Eibishter is accepted it, but when the Eibishter did say Yakrivos Korbonom, they should go Lachanukas Mizbeach, that means that Hashem says yes, that's the way they have it, and that's what we should do it. Is the Akrova given up to Hashem? That was by the command of Hashem, because Hashem accepted it. Hashem said, "Go ahead and do it." This was Hashem's instructions. So we have to say, similar to these heroic shows, to the Ketores and the other things, so that at the end of the day was Hashem's instruction. So we have to say the Agolis, Hashem, once Hashem approved it, it was Hashem's instruction. So it's not so difficult. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu, why did the Nisim give so few? Because it wasn't up to them. That's what the Eibishter wanted. As Obenit mistaber zu zogen, but therefore it's not logical to say as their mispar hagolis is a chuko gzeres hakosuf, that how many wagons is going to be a statue and a decree of the posik on kein shum tam, without any reason, just that's the way it is, that's the way Hashem was. There's no reason, and this goes contrary to the logic. And like I said before, they should have brought more. So even though we're saying now it was with the agreement and it was Tzivu Hashem, but why is there no logic to this when it seems to defy logic, bringing a half a Hagolah, participating to an Hagolah? Ubefrat as Kinal, and especially as we said before, the Mispar is given Kfidaito. Started off by their opinion. Yes, the Eibishter agreed. Uner's der noch is nidgalig geworden de Elyonen. Later on, it was revealed the supreme God that Eibishter agrees with that. But the Chatchila, it was done based on their what they wanted to give. So we still need to understand why did they want to give only a half a wagon. Ulahoir, and the Rebbe wants to point out, as badi korbanos was haben gebracht lachanukas hamizbeach, those korbanos they brought to inaugurate the Mizbeach, we don't find elsewhere, azak su korbanos, such a type of korbanos, and azak oifen akrov, in such a way that they were sacrificing. So what Taka is saying, it doesn't, it's not fitting. It comes from Hashem, but yet we have reasonings for them. Is afal piados is given even though it was a instruction just for that time, it's a one-time thing, it's a deal for that time. Is dot timing remozim of them sug? There is reason, there's hints for that category. Why did they bring such a type of korbanos over there? And also the number, mispara korban shanasim. V'chazal zayne mevar barucha, as our sages explain at length. So there is also explanation for these heroes shor. So al derech zeh beniten dedan. So also in our case, we need to have an explanation. But the nidvas ha'agolis, when we talk about the gifts of the agolis, darf men zogen, we need to say, ados was the nidvas ha'agolis v'aboker zayin given b'miut b'tzimtzum. The fact that the wagon and the cattle were few and they were exact. What they needed was l'cheire hepech haklal, which seemingly goes against the general rule in Inyone HaMikdash, when we deal with matters of the Mikdash, as einan used b'mokem hashirus, kenal sif alas, that there is no place for being acting poor and stingy in a place where there is wealth by the Beis HaMikdash. Kenal sif aleph, as we said before in the Sifal. We have to say is do the reif tam v'hasbore. So there needs to be a reason, an explanation. As azoy darv zayin in der nedove, that's the way that it needs to be in this gift. The Rebbe is saying, even if we say that this is what the Eibishter wanted, but first of all, it came from them, and then the Eibishter agreed. But even all those things that the Eibishter agreed, which was exceptional in this case, doesn't mean that we say, oh, this is a decree, and that's why they did it against the logic. On the contrary, we find all reasons why is it what they did. So it's logically we have to say that there's a good reason over here why we only brought two Nisi brought one Agola, even though that it meant that everything was squished and everything was stingy. It was done because normally it would be Ein Anis b'Mokom Hashirus, but still there was a special intent, and that's what we're looking for. What was the purpose of there? The Rebbe will explain. This is Klorin Gemara, as it's very clear in the Gemara. As do is Negeyo Bahadgosha, that here it is important and emphasized at the Agolas on Zayin B'diuk, that the wagons should be precise. Ubedavke nit longer, specifically not any longer, or nit breiter and not wider. Vider mokim was further than the space that is necessary is a farnochas akroshim to play the kroshim. It must be exactly, there's no extra room over there. Und es soll nicht sein, kein ibrige Ort letzorich hakroshim. Should be no extra place if it's not for the benefit of the kroshim, which means that extra space in between that they would climb up to set it out or over there. You utilize every aspect of it. If them was Eirech Agola Chomesh Ames, how do you see this? Because the Gemara asks, the length of the Agola was 5 Ames. If you put 3 rows, each one you put them on their back, which is an Am and a half, is 4.5 Amma. So if them was Eirech Agola Chomesh Ames, the Gemara says, why is 5? Should have been 4.5. Frag the Gemara, Lomali, why do I need it 5? Barbo Palga Sagi. It should be enough 4.5. You see, when the Gemara answers, the krosh should not be squished. So you gave an extra half an amma, so that they're not, but you see, otherwise they should be exact. Why would the Gemara say, so they made it extra? No, you see from the Gemara wants it to be exact. Similarly, is the width of the Agola. We say that it was Shtei Ames Umechze, it was 2.5 Ames. Frag the Gemara, Lomeli. So the Gemara says Why do we need two and a half? Ba'amsu palgo sagib. That just to have 1 arm and a half, the side that would have been sufficient for the boards that are laying. Und entwert, the one the crushing should not move around, shake around. So you needed to have a little bit of a wider uh, on the agola so that they will sit well on it. But you see from the Gemara that the Gemara is trying to minimize. Why not just say make it a little bit bigger? So you see there must be some idea in it. And that's what the Rebbe is exploring, trying to find why is it that they wanted to use this precise for the agolas and the even though it seems that it's minimal, they're doing the minimal, and it seems like it's being done in a stingy way when it could be done in a much more comfortable way. There must be a reason for it, as the Rebbe will continue to explain. This Dalit, the Rebbe will explain that there's two views, the Medrash and the Rashi and the Sifri, how to view these agolas. Whether they were just a carrying agent, that's the way they moved around the Mishkan on the agolas, or they were actually part of the Mishkan, part of the dedication of the Mishkan, as the Medrash holds that was actually, since it's part of the Mishkan, the Rebbe will explain that once if according to the Medrash that is the Mishkan, then we understand that everything has to be exactly and precise, because in the Mishkan, in the Korbanis, if it's actually a Korban, the Agolis are a Korban, then there can't be any extra for the Korban, as the Rebbe will explain. And then the Rebbe will go on to explain, also according to Sifri and Rashi, that it was just Agolis, why it also had to be precise. But let's go step by step. The Rebbe says, so we can say the explanation is by first introducing one of the changes zwischen Loshen HaSifri and Loshen HaMedrash, between the language used in the Sifri and the language in the Medrash. In the Maimer Azal Hanal Sif Aleph, in the saying of our sage of blessed memory, Sif Aleph, that the Nisim brought this to make up for what they missed out in the Nitvus HaMishkan. In Sifri state, V'chima ro'u Nisim lihisnadev lechatchila kan. Why did the Nisim see fit to make a gift? Doesn't say nothing about a carbon. They just made the gift. Here they gave a gift. They gave the gift of the agolas. And over there they did not gift in the beginning. They waited to the end. Similar is like Rashi, like the Sifri. In Medrash is the Loshen. The Loshen is different. Lomon is darzo hanisim lovoi ulahakriv tchilo. Why did they come hastily to come and to bring an offering in the beginning? Ubemleches hamishkon is natzvul is nisatzvul. They were late to loheviel bachrein. They brought the end. But the Medrash uses the Loshen to come and to bring a carbon first. The Rebbe wants to say that according to the Medrash, this carbon refers to the Agolas as well. Yesh levayir, einem von die Shinu HaLashonos, who can explain one of the change of the language, that in the Medrash says lahakriv and didn't say to bring a gift. As loidem sifri, according to the Sifri, zayin the sheish agolis ushnei osur bokar. The 6 wagons and the 12 cattle need in ageder from a korban. They're not defined as a korban. They're just gifts. Masha'enkin, like the Medrash, by according to the Medrash, is a lahakriv. Love they're the offering. Begeder korban, they have the definition of a korban. That is actually the loshon of the posik. Kiloshin akosov mamish. The posik actually says, "Vayoviu as korbanom." They brought the korban. That is referring to the carriages and the bakar, because these were a korban. That's what the Medrash was. Wie es steht behemshech divrei hamedrash, as the medrash, as it stated in the continuation of the words of the medrash. Kevon shenigbar hamishkon higdimu veviu korban bezrizus. As soon as the mishkan was completed, they came quickly and they brought a korban. It says again quickly. Though the ksiva yakrivu nisi Yisrael v'goymer, that the Nisi Yisrael brought forth. So here we have the Akrivu Nisi Yisrael, which is the pasuk that talks um, about the actual Agolus. That's why the Rebbe in the Ha'ara says here, maybe when it says a korban, he's talking about the korbanos and not about the Agolus, because Vayakrivu Nisi Yisrael is written by the Agolus. And over there it says Vayavias Korban of Hashem. So basically, the Lashon Korban in the pasuk is talking about the Agolus. So therefore, according to the Medrash, that was actually a Korban. The Agolus and the Bakar is actually a Korban. And furthermore, it could be just a Korban at the time that they were carrying it, but there's actually a korban, how they turned in later on, that the actual agolis became a korban. They were actually burnt later on as a korban. Also, as the pain of the medrash that they were a korban, gefitman in aspetedikan ort in medrash. If later on in the medrash says v'hoya Moshe misyare. Moshe was afraid because they had to use these cattle as a real korban. Moshe was afraid. Shemo ma'achas min hagolis nishbara. One of the carriages was broken, and you won't be able to use it as a korban. Oyechad min hashvorim meis. Maybe one of the oxes died. V'nimtzo korban shel nesim. Possible it will turn out that the offering of the nesim, this that they brought, is going to be puzzled. Amalei HaKadosh Baruch Hashem says, V'hoyu, they will be nitan lehem haviyah. They actually gave them a presence, sheyiu kayam will be forever. So they were going to last. When his mamshechim medrash bring verschiedene days, the medrash continues, heichen ikrivam. Where did they bring these agolas, those wood and the karbonis and the cattle? Benoiv ikrivam, that they bought it in noiv or begivon ikrivam. Bebeis Allah lomim ikrivu, or the begilgal, where they bought it. Well, the base Mishkan was standing in Noiv, or standing in Givon, or in Beis Hamikdash, or there in Gilgal. Das heißt, the Medrash Gufa can learn of Tzeyafanim. In the Medrash we can learn, Sifri learns it's not a korban b'chlal, but we can learn here two ways. How is it a korban? According to the beginning of the first medrash, Lavoy ulahakriv, to come and to offer, the karbonis is to bring it. Is there korban beikir in der hagvos hagavra? The main korban consists of, you brought it, that is the korban. Und dem zweiter piske medrash, but according to the second piece in the medrash, v'nimtza korban shel nesim posel, it'll turn out that it's posel if it's broken. Is euch die Hefze, was sie gebracht, the object that they brought, the Agolus and the Shnei Yosef Bokor, geworden a korban. They were burnt as a korban, the Agolus and the Korbanis. Und l'chol adeyes haben gedarft sein nicht mehr von Sheish Agolis, but according to all opinions, whether it's a korban or it's carrying, needed to be only 6 carriages. Afal Piva says that Tzimtzum Heipach Hashirus. Whether we learn like the Medrash, we learn like the Sifri, or we learn what is the car, but all one thing is, according to all opinion, the only 6. Afal Piva says is that Tzimtzum, even though this is 2 very exact Heipach Hashirus, opposite of wealth, from the Agolos Vahabokar, the wagons and the cattle, to make them so precise, so exactly. So whether a korban, whether carrying it, why was it so precise? So first, the Rebbe is going to explain according to the Medrash that it's a korban, and the Rebbe explains um, how this is actually completes the Mishkan by this korban, this bringing of it. It's not just a purpose of carrying, but it's actually completes and inaugurates the Mishkan. This is part of the Chanukas HaMizbeach that makes the Mishkan and makes the Mizbeach. Hey, the beer was explanation. Nochdem with the Medrash Anal is Mefarish. After the Medrash above explains, Omrim Mayesh Lanu Lahavi. So they said, what is there to us to bring? So they went and they brought the agolas that they would carry the Mishkan on them. Is a mamshich. So the Medrash continues. Who gave them this advice? Shifter shall Yisachar. The tribe of Yisachar gave them the ideas of agolas. What they tell them is as follows: Mishkan sha'asisem. This Mishkan that you made, parechu ba'avir, is going to fly in the air. How are we gonna transport it? Eloisnadvu agolis. So Sochar, tribe says, let's gift wagons. Shetiyu noisim oisim behem, that you will carry them in those wagons. So what does it mean? How it's going to fly? Make it that ends the job of the Mishkan, that you create the means by transferring the Mishkan, because otherwise you don't have a Mishkan because you can't fly in the air. So what is the intent in the Medrash? As this is not nor an inyan chitzoni from the Mishkan. This is not just something external of the Mishkan. How are you going to transport it from place to place if you don't have an agolas? Nor the Mishkan vert azach, welche is niso ba'agolas. The Mishkan becomes an item which is carried with the wagons. On the agolas, without the wagons, is the Mishkan Azach Velcher is Aperech Bavir. Without the Agola, the Mishkan is something which flies in the air. The Agolas un Yud Beis Habokor. So what the accomplishment of the wagons and the 12 cattle, so nit nor a mittel ba'alma, they're not just a means, just like that, to feed in the Mishkan, mimokim lemokim, to carry the Mishkan from place to place. Nor as poilt ashinu v'gamar in the Mishkan. This impacts a change and completes the Mishkan. In the Chefza for Mishkan, the object of the Mishkan, it's a flying Mishkan unless you make the Bakar and the Agolas with what to carry. The Bald, as the Mishkan is gebaut geworden als Oil Moyed, it's built as an oil, as a tent. A tent means not permanent. Nit kebinyan kavua, not a set structure, not to game to go from place to place together with the Yidden. Is Kol's mans is an itoke agolus bokor, as long as we don't have wagons and cattle that you can carry on them the Mishkan. Is nit nikber geworden da sie is a Mishkan. Mishkan hasn't been completed because it's a temporary Mishkan, needs means of carrying it. Mishkan shasisam parechu ba'avir. The Mishkan that you made is flying in the air. So the making of the Mishkan, that completes the Mishkan. So according to this comes out, as avos hagolis v'habokar, that bringing the wagons and the cattle is a gamar b'Mishkan. That's a completion in the Mishkan itself. Ame'ein from peulos hakorbonos b'hamizbeach. Similar to korbonos when you bring on the mizbeach. They dedicate, they inaugurate the Mizbeach so that you can offer or regularly the Tmidim Hulu Bitchanukas HaMizbeach, with the dedication of the Mizbeach is geworden der Gemar Asiyas HaMizbeach. That made, completed the building, the making of the Mizbeach. The Hagolis v'habokar, in other words, that is the Karbonis, that ends the dedication. Similar way, the Hagolis v'habokar losses as a Mishkan, the cattle and the wagons to carry the Mishkan, seine biyachas to Mishkan, as they relate to the Mishkan, me'ein korbanis the chinuch hamizbeich lemizbeich. They're similar, just as the dedication korbanis, the inauguration korbanis to the mizbeich, they inaugurate the mizbeich. The agolos and the bokor, they dedicate the Mishkan. With the agolos v'habokor, ver the gemar asiyas hamishkan. That brings about the end of making of the Mishkan. Oh, so the Rebbe explained now how the Mishkan, in order to be a full Mishkan, can't be a Mishkan that flies in the air without having a set way of carrying Mishkan from place to place. That set way to carry from place to place is the actual conclusion and the end of making the Mishkan. Oh, so now that this is part of making the Mishkan, this will tell us that we can learn, just like in Mishkan itself, while the structure of the Mishkan is everything done in a wide way, but there was nothing in the Mishkan that was wasted. Everything in the Mishkan was done in a wide way, but everything had to be utilized. Everything had to be used. This is the Mishkan. The Mishkan, there's no extra. Rebbe will bring several examples, both. Pianal is verstandig, based on the above, it's understood. As kishem wie in Mishkan und Beis Hamikdash Gufa. Just like in the Mishkan, the Beis Hamikdash itself. Afal Pias is given an Hoga from Hashidus Baruch Haba. Even though the conduct was, it was wealth and in a wide way. Is aber nicht given ken ein Prat. Prat de Prat. Still, there was not even one detail, or a detail of a detail, welches nicht ausgenutzt geworden, which has not been utilized for an act and something specific in the Mishkan. There was nothing just like that. Everything was utilized for the Mishkan. And the Rebbe says, Rebbe wants to emphasize how strong this is. If you brought something to the Mishkan that wasn't utilized, then it's like bringing Chulin La'azorah, because you're not allowed to bring in weekday, because it's not part of the serving anything in the Mikdash. So as der Chelek Prat, if there is a part and a detail, was is miyuta, which is extra, and it's not utilized in Mishkan, Dikri Mikdash, which is called the Mikdash. So in the Mikdash, you can't bring Chulin La'azorah. Is a me'ein for Machnus Chulin La'azorah. That's similar to bringing in weekly into the Azorah. Adover Choyle Mishkan, you're bringing something weekly in the Mishkan because it's not utilized for any purpose of the Mishkan, so you can't bring it into the Mishkan. Al derech zeis benegates that the Agolis ubokor v'chazayin achilik for Mishkan. Similarly, is as it relates to the cattle and the wagons as they become part of the Mishkan. Adosot gemus zayin b'midah b'diyakas b'tachlis, that needed to be with exact, precise, total measurement, like pochus, not less, aber euch lo yeser, not extra. As es only zayin ein prat v'chel, there should be no part or portion, was wird nicht ausgenutzt for their zweck, which is not being utilized for its purpose, which is trogen the Mishkan, to carry the Mishkan. Everything needed to be utilized and carry the Mishkan. Sayin den midah bekamos, both in the measure and quantity, sheish agolis midzeri midis midioks canal. It should be 6 wagons with the precise measurements, as we said before. Nit merer agolis, not more than 6, or nit greser agolis, and not larger agolis. That was in the wagons. The wagons had to be the exact number, the exact size. Sai in the Shnei Osor Bokor, as the Rebbe brought before from the Gemara, that the sizes couldn't be any lower. Sai in the Shnei Osor Bokor was for the Agolos. And also the 12 cattle that lead the Agolos had to be exactly. Why couldn't they get another cattle to schlep this? Choch das is a masse kwede beyeser. Even though this is a very extremely heavy load, darf man haben, as es soll ausgenutzt werden beschleimes. We need, however, we need that to fully utilize completely the koiches von jede von the Shnei Osabaka. Each one of the 12 cattle, some gefirt agolos led the agolos, they need to use fully their strength, not extra strength. Und wenn in dem wird gewinn a größere Mida, oder mehrere agolos v'chulu, and had there been larger measurements of the agolos, or more agolos, etc., is nicht nur as the Sofa wird nicht kein Chelek von der Asiyas HaMishkan. Not only does this addition not become part of making the Mishkan because it's not needed, but damit is as nicht der Shir von the Agolas. That's not the measurement of the Agolas. The Agolas need to be exactly for their purpose. Biz askro yiseder kamashmalon. Until there's an extra pasuk that teaches us that kol kesev hakelim v'goymer lelamdoch shahoyu klei hamigdash mechubonim. This is the pasuk that tells us all of the vessels, and in Sifri and Rashi, that why does the pasuk say all the vessels of the kelim? The reason why the Torah enumerates, as the pasuk says, they came out to Alpine Barba Meiz B'Shekel HaKodesh. Why is it so important? Is Lamdoch Shoyuklei HaMikdash Mekuvonim B'Mishkolom, that they were exactly in their weight, exactly, so it came out. Shoyklon Echod Ve'echod. You weigh them one by one, the right measurement, Veshoklum Kulo Ke'echod, and then when you weigh them all together, Le'riba V'le'miyah, there wasn't extra and wasn't less. It had to be precise. Extra was no good either. You don't make anything extra. Ulahoyir from them din, Rebbe says also to point out the halacha as klishoris a mekachnel malayim, that the klishoris can only make kodesh when they're full. So that means that if you make a klishoris, you make it kodesh, it has to be utilized fully. The entire keli has to be full of what you're filling it up with in order to make it kodesh. So you see that a mamish has to be full in order to be mekadesh. So that shows us the essential part to utilize every aspect and not to have extra. The Rebbe is going to add a further explanation why it needed to be precise, because this explanation is really mostly goes according to the medrash that this agolis were like a korban, and therefore the korban has to be exactly, but not if it was just a means of carrying it. The Rebbe is going to explain now that also according to the Sifri, it was exactly because really the Levim were supposed to carry it. This was just to take off some of the burden, but we didn't want to take off too much of the burden. So therefore, it just met the minimal to help relieve some of the difficulties. Zayin, v'yesh lo hishe we can add to it. Befrat, especially as biur hanal, the above explanation is loitin medrash, goes according to the medrash as oich di agolis shnei osar bokor, that also the wagons and the 12 cattle, in addition to the regular korbanos that the Nisim brought, they have them defined as a korban. Und der Riber Tor bei sie nicht sein kann ein Prat v'chelik, and therefore they must not have even one detail and one part, was wird nicht ausgenutzt für dem Zweck, which is not used for their purpose. Carrying the Mishkan needs to be, that's the full avodas HaMishkan. Und in trogen the Mishkan, we can now add to carry the Mishkan like we said before. Aber das ist Sifri. Well, that is a Lepidish Rashi, but according to the opinion of the Sifri, this is not a sufficient answer. Same thing Rashi. Was eine Mefarish, they explain as mod gebracht da Golus Bokar, that the reason they brought the Agolos Boker not as a korban, losis as a mishkan, to just to carry the mishkan, was and thereby nit madgish, and they don't emphasize the hope mageda from korban that they have a definition that are treated like a korban. Yesh levayer, we can explain them diuk and them tzimtzum b'mispur from the Agolos Vaboker, can explain the question and the precise, the narrow, exact, stingy sort of number in the Agolis, and only six, and the cattle. The Rebbe said, Masa Mishkan is given eine from the Avedis from the Levim. Carrying the Mishkan was one of the service of the Levim. Verzog b'tchilas hasedra, he says in the beginning of the Sedra, Zois Avedis Mishpaches HaGershuni Laved Lamasa. This was the service of the Gershuni family to serve and to carry. Al derech zeh by the Bnei Merori, similar also the Bnei Merori. V'zois mishmeres masom. This was their guard. They were carrying l'chol avidosim b'oil moed, all their work that they needed to do in the oil moed. The Bnei Merori, they were karshe hamishkan. These were the beams of the mishkan. As his move on. So basically, carrying was the responsibility, and it was on the Levim. It's understood as b'shaz der eibishter otong izokach meitom, that take from them v'hoyu ha'golus v'habokar, that the eibishter says, okay, let the wagons and the cattle lava the savedus oil moed for the work of the oil moed v'nosata oisum el alevim ish k'fi avidose. Give them to the Levim, each one according to the work that they need to do. Is not given the kavanah thereby. The intent here was not Sunem from the Levim, the Avedas Masa B'Kodesh, to take away from the Levim the service of carrying in holiness, which they were instructed. That is the Levim's Kedusha. That's the holiness of the Kedusha, to carry the Mishkan. Nit Sunem the Mechiv from the Levim, not to take away the obligation of Levim. Nor the Avedas Masa is given und geblieben. The service of carrying was and remained mutal of the Levim, that was placed on the Levim by Ariflegen the Chelka Mishkan of the Agolas, by Maropnemazei, by putting up the parts of the Mishkan onto the wagons and by taking them down. Und euch b'shaz is eine gelegen of the Agolas, so they were involved. In other words, they put them on, take them off. They didn't carry their shoulders, but they were putting them on. And also while they were in the Golos and they in the Levim noch gegangen, they had to follow with Chuluk. Kedil come on. As later on, when the Agolos are given nor it was to make easier. The only reason that the goal is to make it easier, to ease their load. Behainu, euch demot, that means that also then zane nida golus b'nei habokor, the Naso Mishkan. So even then, it's not that the wagons and the cattle are the ones that carry the Mishkan. It's the Levim carrying it. No, the Levim trogen the Mishkan durch the Agolos. The Levim are carrying it through the Agolos. The Agolos is the means they carry. Und the Riber is Kimol Ledaitom Ledaisel Yonam. And that's why they came up with the correct view like Hashem intends. They gave generally only 6 agolos. For the masa covered from Bnei Merori, it's given nor 4 agolos. And for the heavy load of Bnei Merori, there was only 4 of the crushing. The avodas masa muz zayin ba'oifen. It needs to be in a way. As a Ben Levi zol noch gehen kol haderech, it needs to be. It needs to go after the tie road, after the wagon, and to observe and to make sure. Sees them moved it into the ear. He rots chuluk and alsifalev is brought down in sifalev. But the Levim zayin in the Naso Mishkan. The Levim and they're the one that carry the Mishkan. Just to make easier through the Agola. So we're not trying to make it wide and easy for them, comfortable. It needed to be very, so they should be carrying it. How? By running after it. And therefore, if it was wider, it would take away from the Levim. That's why it was such a precise and limited and not in a wide way. Ches. The Rof and the Mavedis Odom. What is the lesson for this in the service of man? Chazal Zogan, our sages of blessed memory, say us, Kol Mashabar Kodesh Baruch Hu Be'ilomei Leborod Ovrecha Levatol. Everything HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem created in the world, nothing was created in vain. Was der klal is alamol umetun. That rule is always and everywhere, B'chol Chelke Protavri, in all parts and details of creation. Everything that Hashem creates is nothing in vain. Vasiyas HaMishkan Vadamut is geworden Bosi Legani Legnuni. When they made the Mishkan, then took place, Hashem says, I came to my garden, to my dwelling place, to my place of pleasure, as noch die alle Chatoim was haben geben gewen Siluk HaShchina. After all the sins that caused the removal of the divine, is Yordo HaShchina Lamata Ba'oret, the Shchina descended below into the earth. In the Mishkan, Va'osul im Migdash Shechanti B'Seicham, make me a Migdash, I will rest amongst you in the Mishkan. Is damod bigmar meleches hamishkan. So then, at that time, when they finished the Mishkan, arois gekum begilui, it came out openly. Became shum prat is nit levatol chas v'sholom, that there is no detail that is in vain. God forbid. But yet, der einzige prat wird ausgenutzt b'shleimus. Every detail is utilized fully. For the tafkid zu welchen der Eibishter ihm beschaffen. For the goal, for the purpose which Hashem created. Mishkan is Hashem's presence in the world. The end of the Mishkan emphasizes this idea that everything has to be utilized. In the far, and therefore, Chodj dan hog in the Mishkan, in the Mikdash, is Beifen Shalashidus, even though the general conduct of Mikdash is in a way of wealth. Is das aber nicht in a but it's not in a way of waste, God forbid. Nor es is nicker, it can tell, jeder prat führt durch sein Tafkid zu Tachlis Briose, that every detail accomplishes its mission and the goal of its being created, und the river. And therefore, wie bald as if lost is as a Mishkan, since to carry the Mishkan, seine genug Yud-based Bokar, 12 cattle is enough, und Sheish Agolas and 6 carriages, at the specific length and width, hot, kein Ort nicht, there is no room, no place, am soll der Ref Meister sein, you should add to it. Und dem Behäuser, was is da, and the extra that exists, darf muss es ausnutzen in der zweiten in the Mishkan. You need, and it has to be utilized in some other aspects of the Mishkan, not just to waste thing. Was von dem is the hero zu jeden Eden. From this is the lesson for every Yid in Asis Mishkan Aprati Shaloi, about making your own personal Mishkan. Kemaim Razal Vasuli Migdash Chanti B'Seichem. Sages of blessed memory say on the verse, make for me a sanctuary and I will dwell amongst you. Doesn't say within the Mikdash I will rest, but amongst you, which means the Mishkan, and every Yid has a Mishkan. Amongst each and every one of the Yid. How much we see a person needs to be careful. As yeder koyach b'chol proto, that every detail and every power and all the details of the Eibishter him gegeben, that Hashem gave soll nicht sein levatolach has v'sholem, should not be to waste, God forbid. Nos ausnutzen ihm in their full stermos, but rather to utilize it the fullest measure for the tachlis v'tafkid, for the goal and mission to livelchen that Eibishter him beschaffen, that Hashem created him. Everything that you have needs to be utilized for this, nothing in waste, for the mission of I have been created to serve Hashem. This is talking about every power within the powers of your soul. To listen, to know. Abishah said, Lerun Torah, when he's studying Torah, and he's not putting enough effort as necessary, then he's not utilizing properly as necessary that power that David gave him, the power that Hashem gave him, because he's not fully utilizing it. Similarly, It's in every detail within his qualifications, his talents, as Overen Oisgenutz L'Shem Shamayim, that it should be utilized for the sake of Hashem, und zu lieb da'eu, to know Hashem. If Kim ha-mitzvahs und Kim ha-mitzvahs beider, so that you fulfill mitzvahs, the mitzvah of perfection, everything should be utilized for that. So same thing true also specifically in the inyan von Hafotzer Halus Chutza, to spreading out Yiddishkeit to the outside. Same thing is also time. To utilize all the time as a feel and a given. Even if he had already filled, ungefüllt 23 schon mit 59 Minuten. 23 hours and 59 minutes from the Meisles. Darf sich mishtadel sein. Has to put an effort in das euch the einzige übrig gebliebene Minute. There's only 1 minute left in the 24 hours that he has. Soll nicht gehen levatolach shalom, should not be wasted, God forbid. That's the level to utilize everything for the purpose when you're learning Torah, when you're doing mitzvahs, to utilize building your own mishkan, to make sure you utilize all your talents and all the details of your talents. Tess. This is the lesson that we learn from the Mishkan. As B'shas is da an ibrike zach, that when there is something extra, that does not accomplish its mission fully, felt as damals in klolus asiyas hamishkan, then there's something lacking in the building of the Mishkan in general. Also lacking in the dwelling amongst you. When he misses out and he doesn't utilize even a very small detail, that's in the portion of the world, and it goes to waste, God forbid. This, so to speak, creates a confusion in creation for the Meibishten. Hashem didn't create anything in vain, and now he's wasting it, and this thing becomes in vain, so this creates a confusion in creation. But when he utilizes all of his strength, for that I was created to serve Hashem, that accomplishes resting amongst you, by from gold in the revealed way, by the person himself, in that way also in the entire world. For durch them, because through the fact that every detail in creation durch them tafkid accomplishes the mission to lieb, welchen der Eibishter hat dem prat beschaffen, for what the purpose that God created that detail. It's revealed in creation and every part of creation. That this is a creation of Hashem openly because it's utilized for Hashem. And the third Beis Hamikdash gets built, and within it the sense, the Mishkan, also Moshe was his time lad, the Mishkan built. The Moshe built, which stands forever, a oil vessel, kale of the oil and all of his vessel goimer. In the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, in the third Beis Hamikdash, which will be very speedily in our day of the Mashiach Tzidkenu, through the righteous Mashiach. As get nit durch kein regel of atoloch al v'shol. Not one instance is wasted, God forbid. There's no delay at all. Hashem doesn't delay them, even as the blink of an eye, miyad mamish. This is Mesichas Shabbos Parshas Naso Tovshin Lamed Gimel, Moitzoi Shabbos Parshas Naso Tovshin Lamed Ches, and Yud Beis Sivan Tovshin Mem Beis.